In 1970, we wanted to establish the extent to which parents allow their children to get about outside the home on their own. That is, to go to school, to visit friends, to go to the park, or whatever. And therefore, we conducted surveys in 5 different parts of the country. And we asked children in those different parts, ranging incidentally from an inner London borough to a rural parish in Oxfordshire. We asked the children to record on these survey forms how they'd come to school, what they had done at the weekend, and the surveys were conducted on Mondays to avoid problems of recollection, and also prepared and had filled in questionnaires which the children took back to their parents to fill in, and those were questions principally focused on the attitudes of parents, where they didn't allow their children to do this, that or the other. They were asked to say for what possible reason was this. And the outcome of that process was very useful in terms of knowing the difference between what we realised was bringing up children as free-range children or as battery-reared children. There was quite a marked distinction in the attitudes of parents and in the travel patterns of their children by virtue of the freedoms that parents felt able to allow their children to enjoy and to control the extent of risk to which they would be exposed. Subsequent to this, we were particularly interested in monitoring the changes that occurred over the years in these patterns of activity of children, particularly the extent to which they were allowed to do things on their own, to be in effect independent of constant adult supervision, either supervision from their parents or other members of the family or from teachers. And it seemed to us that we had no hold and understanding of how this was changing, and it was essential to do so and to know about this from the point of view of the development of public policy, which was determined in order to improve the quality of life of children. Children, after all, do not just live their lives in order to go to and from school. It only represents about 1 in 2 days of the year that they go to school, if you include weekends, half-terms and holidays. And in fact, of course, after leaving home, particularly on the lighter months of the year, they also have evenings, and those evenings can be occupied very often by leisure activities, certainly leisure time in which to choose to do what they want, but of course then subject to whether their parents will allow them to do so. The remarkable thing is that there is really no voice in government and no minister who has the responsibility for looking after the interest of children, particularly when new legislation is proposed. And that is interesting because they need to have somebody to be focused on that. Otherwise, they are likely to miss out, and they can't, as a group, have a voice of their own because they're only what are treated as second-class citizens. And it seemed that we would be able to remedy that through studies which highlighted the changes in their circumstances and to determine whether those changes were advantageous or disadvantageous from the point of view of children. It seemed to us important to see whether children's lives were becoming more or less circumscribed by their parents, owing to an understandable fear that parents have about the risks to which their children would be exposed if they allowed them out. Of course, principal concern being the rise in the levels of traffic out on the roads and therefore the dangers to which they were exposed. In that 1990, I was having a discussion with John Adams at University College London, and we were discussing the dismay that we both felt about the way in which the government at the time was in effect passing the buck on the dangers to which children were exposed. The poster 4 children said on it, "One false move and you're dead." And it was addressed to children showing a child's foot on the curbside. It seemed to us quite wrong, even at a moral level, to in effect apportion blame to children if they inadvertently crossed the road without taking sufficient care. After all, that is the natural process that children engage in, which is to not be absolutely careful when they're getting about on their own. We therefore approached the Department of Transport to see whether they would provide a fund to look into this subject. What John Adams and I had observed was that the then measure of road safety was the number of casualties on the roads, in this case, of course, in relation to children. But we considered that an explanation for the very encouraging and fairly dramatic reduction in the level of casualties among children was not explained, as was implied, by our roads becoming safer, but rather the reverse. A quite remarkable observation when you think of it, because what we were saying was with more traffic, you get less casualties among children, because what is happening is that parents are not allowing their children out, in effect, exposed to the greater risk. We therefore decided that one way of demonstrating whether this hypothesis was true or not was to replicate the surveys we'd carried out in the schools around the country 20 years previously. And what we hoped this would do would be to see what changes in circumstances of children, particularly in relation to their freedom and independence outside the home, what changes had occurred in that 20-year period. We thought that we would identify some increase in the restrictions imposed on children by their parents. What staggered us was that not only were we right, but we were right with a vengeance. As an illustration of this, children of 7 and 8 years old, we found that in 1970, 80% of them had gone to school on their own, but 20 years later, that 80% had reduced to 9%. And of course, in the attitude surveys filled in by their parents, the primary reason given was that they were concerned about the rise in traffic levels, in effect confirming our hypothesis. We were also able to make comparison with children in another country. This was Germany, because we had a colleague, John Whitelake, who was working at the time at the Wuppertal Institute, and he was able to carry out matching surveys of children in the same age group to establish whether or not children in Germany enjoyed similar levels of independence and freedom, what we called licenses to get about on their own, as were enjoyed, if that's the right word, by children in this country. In fact, the findings showed and surprised us that German children, although living in a society with very similar levels of household car ownership to those in this country, had much more freedom than children in this country. And it appeared to us that this was, by further study, was explained by the fact that children in Germany have an eye kept on them by other adults, very unlike what occurs in this country. In that country, in Germany, adults feel a responsibility to keep an eye on other people's children and to intercede if they're misbehaving or being antisocial or crossing the road carelessly. Adults are far more likely to tick the children off, so that they felt that they had a low level of control in that way. In this country, on the other hand, if adults speak to children that they don't know, or the children don't know them, what would happen is that the adult interfering in the lives of children would be looked on as a suspect paedophile. In fact, the outcome of our studies in 1990 was so influential that the government provided substantial funds for the setting up of bodies which were focused on establishing safe routes to school, in recognition of the fact that there is a danger there, and it is a reason why more and more parents were taking their children to school, usually by car rather than by hand. 20 years later, that is in 2010, we were able to return to the same schools. We obtained a grant in order to carry on this monitoring of the changes of children's circumstances, and were able to show how that had changed over a period of 40 years. In the same schools, obviously likely to be children of the grandparents who had been monitored in 1970, they revealed that that process of removing from children their freedom to get about outside the home on their own, to go to school or to visit friends or the park or so on, that had continued to fall, although less dramatically than it had done by 1990, but it was already very low indeed. We were also able to return to carry out the same surveys in Germany and show the changes there and compare them with the changes in the circumstances of English children. In Germany, it seemed that children there were following more closely the pattern of restriction that we had experienced with our children in previous years. For us, the other exciting sphere of research on children was enabled or facilitated by the fact that we, over time, had developed a relationship with research colleagues in 16 other countries, and they were prepared to organise surveys based on the same original questionnaire that we had produced in 1970, so that we could compare the circumstances of children, the levels of freedom that they enjoyed in countries as far-reaching as Australia, Japan, Sri Lanka, the Netherlands, Norway, and so on. And that was very exciting for us. And again, that revealed the process going on in most of those countries and at a similar level, though it is important to note that par excellence it was the Scandinavian countries that are producing the children with the lesser restrictions on their freedoms to get about, and that is exemplified by the fact that such a high proportion of children in those Scandinavian countries go to school by bicycle, as compared with this country where it's only 2%. In order to draw conclusions about the findings of all these studies of children, both in this country and abroad, we were able to say that the freedoms that children enjoyed in previous generations have been steadily eroded over time, to a degree without anybody really noticing it, because the measure of progress was taken to be the minimisation of risk and the protection of children from exposure to risk of traffic or molestation or abduction of children, those rare circumstances which seem to have such a strong influence on parental decisions about what they will allow their children to do and what they will not allow them to do. It has led in all countries to the erosion of that freedom, and therefore to an increase in effect, the surveillance of children, either by parents and or by other adults and by teachers and so on, which has led to the fact that children are less free. They are increasingly under adult surveillance. And yet, if one considers the really influential events in one's childhood, almost invariably it refers to incidents in the children's lives when they were on their own, in other words, away from adults. Children need to take risks. Children need to explore, to engage in adventure, to do things that stretch their imagination, to enable them to initiate relatively risky things in order to gain experience on how to cope with the outside world. In the absence of these opportunities, the outcome is very likely to be that they have less experience, and therefore in their teenage and later years they're more at risk because they haven't got experience to fall back on. These opportunities are invaluable to children as they enable them to develop a whole range of skills which are essential to their development in acquiring social skills, emotional skills, how to cope with school bullies, how to cope with adults who are asking them questions that they don't feel competent to ask but need to be able to answer in order to, in effect, not feel at a loss. It's physical skills, it's practical skills, all of which contribute to enabling them to mature as adults with the confidence that is essential to that end. Some years ago it did occur to me that children's lives were evolving in a way very similar to convicts. Now that may sound a somewhat extraordinary statement to make, but if you think about it, it is fairly true. Convicts in prison are provided with a roof over their heads, like children, meals laid on regularly, like children, entertainment laid on, like children, engaging in activities but under adult surveillance the whole time, whether through a cell door or bars. Again, the comparison is really very surprising, given that the common feature of it is, and the disturbing feature that I'm highlighting here, is the fact that convicts aren't allowed out on their own in the same way that increasingly children are not allowed out on their own. Well, you could argue that insofar as casualties have gone down, this is wholly an admirable process that has gone on, and it's a reflection of the strategy that society has developed over the years, for which we need not be seriously concerned. How has this come about? I would put it down to a number of misconceptions out there about children and the lives they lead. An important one is the fact that if there is a car or two in the children's household, that their travel needs are basically met. They can be taken to and from school, they can be taken on social outings or to visit the family, or to go to the countryside. But again, those events are in circumstances in which they are not free agents to go about as children would choose to do, to go about on their own and to explore the world, so to speak, in the way that my generation was able to, where parents weren't concerned. The other surprising element in terms of misconception is that cycling is too dangerous a form of travel. Although it is the preferred form of travel of children, it's too dangerous to allow them to use it as their form of travel. And therefore, whilst the great majority of children we found in our surveys own a bicycle, very few indeed are allowed to use them. It's an extraordinary thing. Can you imagine if adults were given cars given a car by some benefactor, but then told, but you're not allowed to use them on the roads, how people would fall about laughing. But in this instance, children do have bicycles in the main, but not allowed to use them in a way that they would far prefer. In the attempt to develop the safe routes to school concept, the idea of having a walking bus, in effect, children gathering together in particular places with one adult at the front of the crocodile and one adult at the back of them, to ensure the safety of children on their way to school. What worries me greatly about that solution to the problem of safety for children on the way to school and back from school is the fact that it is very likely to inculcate in young children's minds the view that on the route taken to school is the equivalent of a safe line to take, But beyond that, it is so dangerous, rather like a minefield, that you better not stray into it. And certainly that best not to speak to people you don't know. We have, over the years, developed the concept of stranger danger, which again inculcates in children's minds a view that if they are spoken to by somebody they don't know, they are immediately suspect and best avoided in engaging in conversation. And to a degree, there is no better way of damaging neighbourly welfare by restricting the conversations that occur outside the home just to those people that they know, certainly in the case of children. Given the downside of all these necessary elements of children's development, it as well to consider what society can do in effect to redress the imbalance that has occurred as a consequence of the loss of freedom of children. Children's health has been disadvantaged in this way because they aren't getting sufficient regular exercise. It's assumed that that exercise is best taken at school, whereas, as I said before, children only go to school on 1 in 2 days of the year, and in those circumstances we need a much broader understanding of how children can spend their lives. The way to do that, of course, is to develop strategies for the situation outside children's homes, namely the outdoor environment, and there to create, as some local authorities are doing, pedestrian and cycle networks where it is safe for children when visiting places, whether it's visiting Gran or going to the park, where it is safe for them to cycle or walk to it. For that, we need to consider the importance of accessibility. In other words, that these facilities that children want to go to, whether it's friends or the park where they can kick a football around, or even smaller places, that these are accessible to them. In other words, the distance isn't too great for them to travel, and that the parents needn't be worried on that score. And where those networks, pedestrian and cycle networks, cannot be provided, then important to ensure that the speed limits for travel on foot or bicycle, well, certainly bicycle and car, are limited to something like 15 or at most 20 miles an hour, where there is far more likelihood of there being no or precious little risk to life by virtue of overtaking traffic or careless drivers driving at dangerous speeds. And they are dangerous over 20 miles an hour if you hit a cyclist, particularly a child cyclist. It's also important to recognise the social function of the street. Streets are not just for travel and transport purposes, they also have a social dimension, and that of course is even more valuable for children than it is for adults. And so we need to take as much advantage as possible of these spaces where pavements are wide or where there's a bit of land left over, which can be used by children with adults about. With the implementation of such a strategy, which is focused far more on children's lives, the vulnerable group in society, we can and will be able to measure success by virtue of the fact that as these strategies are adopted, we will see more children out and about, we'll see more children in groups free to explore and, in effect, or to a degree, get out of their depth, be able to talk and not feel nervous about exchanging conversations with people they don't know, and generally to create far more of a community character to their lives rather than the present fairly intolerable one where it is rare nowadays to see children on their own or indeed in twos doing things on their own in a way that they have obviously chosen to do. Their parents haven't said, why don't you go out on the street? They have chosen to do so, and their parents have allowed to do so because they have felt that the level of risk has been sufficiently reduced to give them confidence to that end.